Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. One small change since I submitted this proposal and when it was accepted. So I'm no longer a principal consultant. I was actually promoted to director. So that's a small change. But again, yeah, I'm happy to be here. It's pretty early where I'm right now. I'm in Chicago, so it's 6:10 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday. But I'm still happy to be here. So without further ado, I'll proceed with my presentation. So the bunch of letters that you can see under my name there, that shows I'm good at multiple choice exams. Hopefully that translates me to being a better cybersecurity consultant, because that's what I am. As was mentioned in the introduction, I have 16 plus years of experience in this domain. And I worked both as a consultant as well as an operator in industry, as in like so being part of security teams at different organizations. So as an operator working working in industry, working in security teams, I worked at a top 3 US bank. I worked at a very large e-commerce startup. And as an advisor, so I was, I mean, other than NCC Group, I had also worked with one of the big four firms. And in that capacity, I have been fortunate enough to advise top 10 Wall Street banks, as well as some very well-known names in Silicon Valley. Now, the picture that you see on the left, that is actually 11 years old, I think. So that's one example where I'm okay with using deprecated information, which typically, obviously, we don't like in security, right? I mean, if something is that old. But now that you see me on screen, you can obviously see there is a lot of difference between how I look now and how I looked a decade earlier. One thing you'll obviously realize is that I'm not a psychologist, right? Even though the title of the presentation says Psychology of the Phish. And the reason I'm going to talk about this topic is, one, because it is interesting and something that I find personally interesting as well. So it combines elements from my experiences as a consultant, as well as a student during my MBA days, when I was first introduced to these principles of influence during a class on leadership and organizational behavior. So this presentation kind of combines lessons learned from both these experiences. So before I move into the psychological elements of phishing, right, and how they're exploited by the cyber criminals, I just want to take like a few minutes to discuss why is phishing popular. So I first want to kind of start off with this quote by Kevin Mitnick. Obviously, if you're in the security world, you know who Kevin Mitnick is, right? So he said most of the computer compromises that we hear about use a technique called spear phishing. It's extremely difficult to defend against. And the reason is that even with the most advanced of tools and technologies, there's still the human element, right, which falls prey to phishing. Because if you think about it, phishing being a part of social engineering, its success is predicated on exploiting normal human behavior, right? So it's and I know you can't really change that a lot. You can a bit by training and awareness, but not a lot. And this is kind of the core message of this presentation. So phishing by the numbers. I mean, if you have an email, and obviously you do, right? Who doesn't? You must have received emails like this, right? Where like damsels in distress or deposed princes, they offer to kind of share a lot of wealth with you as long as you pay like a few $1,000s in processing, or euros, or dollars or euros in processing fees. Now an email like this is very easy to kind of detect that it is a phishing email, right? I mean, the language is bad, right? The English grammar, etc. There are some obvious red flags. But you may have also received phishing emails which look like these on the right. And these are much more sophisticated, right? I mean, they're using the right logo, they're using the right language, and also run things through spell check so that the spelling errors are not there. So you can see like phishing emails kind of span the maturity, right, of the maturity spectrum, right? So So, I mean, it's not that they are always as immature as like princes offering you like millions, but they can be much more subtle and much more nuanced and obviously much more effective. So in terms of numbers, and I even go back a few years, you can see like 2017, 76% of organizations were targeted by phishing emails. Personally, I think that that number may be even higher today. In 2017, around 1.4 million new phishing sites were created each month. I've also linked the sources, and I believe the presentations or recordings will be shared, so you can always find them, Google them up. So in 2018, phishing accounted for 32% of data breaches and 78% of cyber espionage. And then the last data point that I have here, unlike the previous ones, the last one is sourced from law enforcement, right? So while the source of information for the first three bullet points are industry reports, this one is by the US Federal Bureau of Investigation. And they mentioned that in 2019, business email compromise, which is a subset, a kind of phishing attack, caused more than $1.7 billion in losses. And this number, I'm sure, has gone up since then. Now, the economics of email fraud, that we obviously know that phishing is successful. Phishing is popular in the sense that there's a lot of it happening. But why does it work? Why is it popular? Well, if you think about it, the popularity of phishing is driven not only by its success, but its success relative to its cost, right? So if you think of if you think of a legitimate business, right? You invest money, you invest time, you invest effort, and you get returns, right? So as long as these returns are more than what you put in, that means the business is successful. Now, I mean, obviously, phishing is not a legitimate business, but sophisticated cyber criminals operate it like a business. In other words, the time and effort that is put in and the results that are obtained, the results are significantly more. And that's why it continues. That's why the business of phishing continues. And here are some numbers. So there was an actual experiment conducted, and this was around 13 years back, 2008. So researchers for University of California, Berkeley, and University of California, San Diego, they infiltrated the Storm botnet. A botnet, as you know, is basically a network of zombie computers, right? I mean, they have taken over, the attackers have taken over control of the computers to run like mass campaigns, like denial of service or even like phishing campaigns. And the researchers took over, they infiltrated the Storm botnet, and they used it to run fake spam campaigns. I mean, fake spam, this is pretty much like same as phishing here. Spam, when you say spam, you may think like it is kind of irritating, but not harmful. But here we are talking about a harmful use case. So then they sent 350 million emails over 26 days and made these like 28 sales of around $100 each. Now, if you think about it, 350 million emails, but only 28 sales, right? So that seems to be a very poor return on investment. However, think about it. So even with that 0.00001% response rate, it was still yielding around $100 a day, which is obviously not much. But the researchers used only 1.5% of the botnet. So not the entire thing. So if they had used 100%, that $100 per day would have actually resulted in $7,000 per day, which is obviously a pretty good amount of money. And especially considering that the effort is not much, right? There is so much automation, and obviously now it has increased. So due to like this mass emailing tools, obviously, I mean, you can use them for legitimate purposes. And mailing lists, some of which are again legitimate. I mean, when we sign up for things, we often agree as per the terms of service that our email addresses can be shared, and they are kind of bought and sold. So that's a legit example. However, in certain cases, a lot of the information is also sold on the dark web, which is illegitimate, right? But using those emailing tools, right, using those software and those mailing lists, that information about all of us, it's quite inexpensive to carry out a phishing campaign. And you can see that the returns on investment can be very, very high. And that's why phishing is still there and continues to grow. Now, for the core part of this presentation, the 7 principles of influence and how they are leveraged by cyber criminals. So again, I like to start off with a quote, and this is a quote by John Hancock. I should have mentioned it's a U.S. Declaration of Independence. He was one of the kind of founding fathers of the United States of America and signed the Declaration of Independence. And he once said, the greatest ability in business is to get along with others and to influence their actions. So as I said, cyber criminals treat phishing as a business, right? And that's why it is very important for them to be able to influence people, especially for a business which involves influencing people to click on those phishing links. So this work, this presentation is inspired by this person, Professor Robert Cialdini. So he is kind of considered the guru of influence marketing, and you can see from the text on the screen that he has published a lot of bestsellers, like best-selling books in this area, and also advised very well-known like Google, Microsoft, Coca-Cola, etc. So obviously you can see that unlike me, he is definitely a psychologist, and this presentation leans heavily on his work. So the principles of influence. So Dr. Cialdini wrote a book where he talked about these principles of influence. Initially, he included 6 principles, and he later on added a 7th principle. I'll go through all of these, and the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to talk about the principle, right? Then I'm going to talk about how it is used in like in the world outside of phishing, and then I'm going to talk about how this principle is leveraged in phishing itself. So the first principle of reciprocity. So this is very simple to understand, right? It's like you give something and you expect something back, right? So if you do a favor, you expect it to be reciprocated. If someone else does you a favor, that person also expects that you will do something good for them. So there are some very interesting nuances here, right? So if you want to get something, right, to get a favor from somebody, it's always good to kind of act first, right? So basically do that person a favor first and do it again and again, so that you kind of create a bank of favors, so that when you ask that person for something, there's less chance that that person is going to say no. Also, another interesting example is that, let's say that you want to get something, get a favor from something. If you ask for a larger favor initially, right, and that person says no, the possibility that if you ask for a smaller favor, the possibility of that person saying yes is very high. Just because they refuse that larger favor, they are more open to actually saying yes to the request for a smaller favor. So some examples here. Dr. Cialdini, the professor that I mentioned earlier, he sent Christmas cards to strangers, right? Absolute strangers. He didn't know them at all. And many of them sent cards back. So this is interesting, right? Just because they received Christmas cards, they sent them back, right? They send the original sender, they send that person cards as well. So this is the principle of reciprocity in action. Also, another example is that when people were asked to volunteer, right, and they were asked to volunteer, let's say like a few hours every week over a year. So not a lot of people said yes, right, because it's a long-term commitment. However, if they were asked for a few hours only for that week, just because they refused the first request, they were more amenable to saying yes to the second request. So, an example in phishing. An email promises to give you access to valuable information if an attachment is downloaded or a link is clicked, right? So something like, click here to access your new salary, right? Obviously, we want to know our new salary. And it says that if I click this link, then I'll get access to the information. So in other words, I am doing something in the expectation of getting something, right? So this is this principle of reciprocity in action within phishing. Moving on to the next principle, scarcity. Again, this is something that we know by intuition, right? I mean, if people want what is difficult to get, right? I mean, something which is exclusive, which has limited availability, that is automatically perceived as being very valuable, right? And another, like an interesting nuance to this is the fear of losing out is more than the joy of winning, right? So, I mean, obviously both are strong emotions. I mean, you feel happy at getting something, but the disappointment that you get on losing out on something is actually more than that happiness, which is very, very interesting. Example in real life. So television commercial advertised a product saying that, okay, over 500 sold, right? So that means obviously this is in demand. However, it was more successful when it tweaked the messaging and saying that only 25 left to sell. In other words, it is not only in high demand, but there's this fear of losing out, right? So, like people who are watching this commercial, they don't want to lose out, right? As I said, the fear of losing out, the disappointment is more than the joy of winning. And that's why they're more likely to call up the number and order this product. Now, an example in phishing. Email stresses that an access is available only if a certain action is taken. So that means that you already have something, but if you don't do something, you will lose access to that, right? So as I said, the fear of losing out, right? So this example, install this Microsoft Outlook patch to continue having access to your email. In other words, if you don't do it, the email is saying that you will lose access to your inbox. Obviously a phishing email, and something that is very, very successful because it leverages this principle of influence. By the way, hope you, the audience here likes those cat memes. I have one for each of those 7 principles. Principle 3, authority. So people defer to authority, right? Even if it is, whether it is actual or just like somebody's acting, people want to follow leaders, right? And we have seen this a lot, right? I mean, unfortunately, in wars, right, where soldiers commit crimes, right, which they normally wouldn't do just because their leadership tells them to, right? I mean, perhaps the most impactful example is the Holocaust, right, where a lot of German soldiers committed crimes, right, just because their leadership, the Nazi military leadership asked them to. And these people are, the soldiers were obviously normal people, good people in a lot of instances, but they just went along and did those bad stuff just because they were ordered to do so. Now, there was an experiment conducted in 1961, much after the Second World War, which basically validated this. So this professor Milgram, he conducted an experiment where he had 2 sets of volunteers, right? One set was designated as prisoners and one as the jail wardens, right? Basically guarding those prisoners. So what Professor Milgram showed is that if those volunteers who are acting as the jailers, if they were asked to behave cruelly to the prisoners, right, just because it came from someone in authority, these people, right, not perfectly normal people who would normally be kind and everything, they would actually do those stuff, right? They would actually behave cruelly to the volunteers who were acting as the prisoners. They would behave badly with them. They would torture them and everything just because they were asked to do so by someone in authority. Now, an example in phishing, and this is that business email compromise that I mentioned. Excuse me. Email from the CEO, not exactly from the CEO, but somebody who is impersonating the CEO, instructs accounts payable to make an unusual payment, right? So pay $105,000 or euros to buy wire transfer to this new vendor. Now, just because that email seems to be coming from the CEO, obviously an authority figure very high in the org structure, there is a very high likelihood that someone in the accounts department is just going to act on that without really confirming whether this email is legitimate. Again, this is something which, as I mentioned, the US Federal Bureau of Investigation recognizes as a very, very potent and harmful kind of attack, and the losses are in the billions. Moving on to the next principle, consistency. So this is all about exploiting our normal behavior in terms of like the habits that we form, right? Everyone is a creature of habit. So I mean, if you make a request which is consistent with how that person behaves normally, right, it is more likely that that person will say yes. And an example, and the example that I'll mention here. So as I mentioned, I live in Chicago, and there is a very exclusive restaurant called Charlie Trotter's. So it was facing an issue with no-shows, right? So people would call up to reserve tables, right? But then their plans would change, and they would just not show up. Obviously, this is bad for the restaurant, because if a table is reserved, it cannot be reserved by someone else, right? And obviously, even if a customer walks in without a reservation, they cannot be seated at that table because that table has already been reserved. So what this restaurant did was, when they would receive these telephone calls for the reservations, they would end the conversation by saying that, okay, if your plans change, can you please call us to let us know to cancel the reservation? So this is normally implied, right? I mean, that if plans change, a customer should call. But as you saw, as I mentioned, this was not happening, and that's why the restaurant was facing losses. So they made this implied promise as something explicit, right? They said that, can you please call? So and obviously the customer would say yes. Just the fact that the customer said yes, right, made them more likely to actually call up the restaurant. The reason is that normal people, right, unlike politicians, right, if they make a promise, they like to keep it. So the fact that they said yes, I'll call if my plans change, that made it a promise. And people, as I said, are more likely to kind of follow up if they make a promise. That is normal behavior. That is a habit. And that's why this restaurant, this problem of no-shows after reservations, this problem reduced substantially. Now, how this is used in phishing? Email from a familiar brand asks for confidential information, right? So something like, your Amazon package is on the way. Please click here to confirm your shipping address. Now, pretty much all of us order stuff from Amazon, right? So this has become a habit. So if we receive an email which shows that it is from Amazon or looks like it, we are less likely to really dig deep and see that, okay, is this a legitimate email? It's just that we expect emails from Amazon to arrive, right? Saying that, okay, your order is on the way and stuff like that. And we are more likely to click on that phishing link. I mean, this happens even if we have not actually ordered something on Amazon. We still receive an email which says that your order is on the way. A lot of people will actually click that link just because it is by force of habit. Again, this is a psychological thing that is exploited by the cyber criminals. Principle 5, consensus. This is all about the power of the crowd, right? So people tend to follow the crowd. If a lot of people are doing something, then, well, it must be good. I should also do that. So this is seen at like during riots, right? Like mobs and everything, as well as like people at a rock concert, right? So everybody is like moving like this, or putting up their phone, moving it around, moving around the lighted screen. So people go along with the crowd. So an example in marketing. So TV commercial ended with the call to action that, okay, you've seen the product. Now, if you want to order, operators are standing by. Please call this number. However, their rival, they were more successful by saying that if operators are busy, please call again. In other words, they're implying that a lot of people are buying our stuff, right? And that's why the phone lines are busy. So that means the crowd is with us, so you should also follow along. An example in phishing, an email says that how many of the recipient's colleagues have already done something, right? So if you receive an email that, okay, 544 of 800 employees in your organizations have already updated their operating system, click this link to download. So The recipient feels that, okay, so many of my colleagues are doing this, so this must be a legitimate thing, so I should click as well, right? So I love this meme especially, which says, I'll tell you when to patch right meow. So right now, right meow. Again, with the cat memes, and again, this is a tactic that is very, very successful. Excuse me, let me get a small drink of water. All right, the sixth principle of liking. By the way, this picture is from a very famous and popular American comedy series called Friends. And the reason I have it, because this principle aligns very well with friendship. So people make requests to people they like or those who like them, right? And because they feel that the chances of getting a positive response are higher, right? So I mean, this is like something that we know from common sense, right? So if people like you, right, they will say yes to the request. Similarly, if you want to be liked, you're more likely to say yes to the requester. So an example, I mean, here the example is just the fact of life, right? I mean, if you ask your spouse or partner for a favor, and typically you would ask them for a bigger favor than you would ask a colleague, right? Of course, that depends, that may change based on how your relationship is with your spouse and how your relationship is with your colleague. But in general, you do kind of ask bigger favors from your spouse. So an example in phishing, an email from HR, I mean, obviously not actually from HR, but which looks like it came from HR. It asks a new employee for confidential information. Now this new employee is obviously eager to be liked, right? He or she wants to kind of create a positive impact right from the beginning. They want to be liked, right? They want to be successful in their new workplace. So if they receive an email asking for information, they're more likely to say yes or respond quickly. So something like, we don't have your SSN in our records, can you please reply? So cyber criminals actually exploit this, right? Very much. So they actually go dumpster diving, right? Looking at discarded printouts to understand who the new employees are, so that these new employees can specifically be targeted by emails like this, which exploit this particular principle of influence called liking. Again, something that is very, very successful. Now, moving on to the last principle, number 7, called unity. So this was not on the original list. It was added later by Dr. Cialdini. So this is all about how people identify with being part of different groups, right? So the idea is that more we identify ourselves with others, the more we're influenced by them. And politicians are really, really good at exploiting this principle, right? So politicians always want to show that they are just like the people that they're asking votes from, right? So they always say that, okay, I'm just like you, right? And that's why recently you may have noticed that politicians are very okay with opening up about their faults, right? So like if they have taken drugs in college, right, or if they have like cheated, they are open about it because it shows that they're just human, right? That they have faults like a human. So again, this is how politicians basically leverage this principle of influence. And now another example that I would like to mention here. So the same Dr. Cialdini, right, who formulated these principles, he once asked his students' parents to complete a questionnaire, but the response rate was very low, only around 20%. Then he offered one extra point, right? Which, if you think about it, 1 point on a single test, right, on a single paper in one semester, it's not really that important. I mean, if you think about like the 4 years of a typical college that, I mean, at least in the US, right, then one paper in one semester across 4 years is inconsequential to the overall grade, whatever the rating the student will get. But just because he made that request and saying that he will do something positive for the students, and obviously the students and parents are part of the same family, the response rate jumped to 97%. The reason is, right, because the parents, they identify as being part of the same family unit as their children, obviously, and that's why they want to do something good for them. It's all about being part of that same group. So in phishing, it may be like an email from someone with a shared interest. So an email says, okay, hello, as a fellow cat lover, can you please sign this petition? Obviously, the phishers would do their research, right? They may actually go on social media to see that, okay, you're a cat lover or a dog lover, right? Based on pictures on Facebook. So, and then they can send very targeted phishing emails like this, which basically says that, okay, you and me are very similar, right? And that's why don't you do this for me? So it's all about, as I mentioned, being part of that group. So these are the 7 principles, how they are used in life outside of phishing, and then how they're used in phishing as well. Now I want to take a few minutes to kind of discuss how you can protect yourself against phishing. So first, I would like to talk about the castle approach. It is also called like layered security or defense in depth. But the idea is that it's basically multiple layers of controls, right, to protect against attackers. So what you see on screen, that's like the attackers from the medieval age, and a castle which has those different controls such as limited entry points, outer wall, inner wall, moat, guards checking identity, etc. So in other words, this is like defense in depth with multiple layers. So a similar approach is used today. Obviously, the attacker has changed, as has that treasure that is being safeguarded. So earlier it may have been gold, the castle itself. Now it is data, right? I mean, important data, and the attacker is obviously a hacker. And similarly, we have these different layers of controls. They can be kind of segregated into administrative, physical, and technical controls, right? And here the CISOs, the Chief Information Security Officers, are the lords of the castle being the enterprise. The reason I mention this is because I want to address this question of protection against phishing through this lens of administrative, physical, and technical controls. Well, I mean, physical controls, there aren't any, right? Because unless you actually physically grab the person and prevent that person from clicking on the link, physical security controls doesn't really apply here. So I'm going to talk mainly about technical and administrative controls. So with technical controls, there are many, right? And I'll quickly go through them. I'm not going to read the entire content. You can always look back at it later in the recording. But you have different controls like spam filtering, right? Which will flag certain keywords or blacklisted URLs. It can also do a checksum comparison to determine if that email is part of a mass email campaign, which is obviously a red flag, which makes it a little risky. There's also IP blacklisting, which can block emails from specific IPs or IP ranges, such as North Korea. Right? I mean, under normal circumstances, you won't be receiving any emails from North Korea, right? If it is a very high likelihood it is a phishing email. Then you have a web proxy, which doesn't block the email itself, but blocks access to the phishing sites, and also it executes any executable content like Java and Flash script. It executes in the sandbox environment, so it is not executed at that end user's browser and their and that endpoint, that laptop. So it just keeps it safer. So these are all different mechanisms to prevent or protect against phishing. There are a few more. Sender Policy Framework, or SPF. This is authentication to detect if the sending address has been forged. DKIM, domain keys identified email. This is also authentication, email authentication. It goes beyond SPF. Basically checks whether that email is digitally signed and then verifies that digital signature. And then DMARC, or domain-based message authentication reporting and conformance, with kind of combines SPF and DKIM. And again, based on the authentication, the administrator can actually specify what action needs to be taken, whether it can be delivered, whether it will be quarantined, or whether it will be blocked straight away. The reason I mention all these tools is because in my experience as a consultant, a lot of organizations are actually pretty good at enabling these different tools. However, people still get phished, right? You hear about that all the time, right? Why is it? Why does that happen? That happens because, as Bruce Schneier once said, and he is a pretty well-known name in the security world, cryptography, etc. He said that amateurs hack systems, professionals hack people. In other words, if you look at this cartoon, right, even with all the technology, we still have human error. And as I said, phishing, as part of social engineering, it exploits normal human behavior, right? So that's why even with all these tools and technical controls, people will still get phished. So how to stop that, or how to at least reduce that? And that is where administrative controls come into play. Now, administrative controls are all about like having the right rules, right? And also awareness and training. So a lot of you may be aware of this quote that I've mentioned at the top. I hear, I know, I see, I remember, I do, I understand. Now, nothing creates understanding of phishing than actually falling victim to a phishing attack. Basically, you learn from that experience. Obviously, that's not an ideal situation. So the next best way to learn about phishing is basically to be subjected to phishing simulations, right? This is where the security person in the organization will send out mock phishing emails and see whether people actually click. If they do, then they provide additional training that, okay, this is the reason you shouldn't have clicked, and this is the reason why you should have realized that this is a phishing email, or even suspected it to be a phishing email. So my recommendation is that when these phishing simulations are being conducted, and they should be irregularly conducted, you can't just send, you can't be consistent that you're sending out a mock phishing email the last Friday of every month. Then the employees will obviously realize, right? They will come to expect that this is going to happen, and they will easily detect that it is a mock phishing email. So this phishing simulations should be conducted irregularly, and they should leverage one or more of the principles of influence that I just went through, those 7 principles. And anybody who clicks should be required to take additional training. Some of the common indicators of phishing. So if you're using, if a sans serif font is being used, right, something like Arial, then the uppercase I for India looks exactly like the lowercase l. So in other words, if that email says Google in Arial font, it may actually be saying GOGGIE and not GOGGLE. So again, these are some flags that organizations can train their employees to catch. Also, sometimes Unicode characters can resemble ASCII characters. So what you think as the letter A in the English alphabet may be something completely else. Nowadays, browsers actually take care of a lot of these discrepancies. But in order to kind of have that advantage, the organization should mandate that employees always use the latest versions of the browsers. In general, it is always good to kind of distrust and verify. And the basic rule of thumb is, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. Moving on to kind of the last section of the presentation, anecdotes and lessons learned. And here I want to quote this rapper. He's very well known in the US. So he once said that I was never really good at anything except for the ability to learn. I think that really applies here. And personally, I want to mention some of the mistakes that I have seen and also made myself. So this particular attack chain at a particular client of mine, this is exactly the business email, not the business email comment. This is exactly what I see at a lot of my clients, right? Not just one of them. And this is where executives, right, the senior people, they are often more likely to click on phishing links, right? The reason is that a lot of these executives are not very tech savvy, even if they think that they are. And also because they're targeted more, just because of the fact that they have more privileged access, right? So an executive will possibly have more access to the different systems, will have more authority to kind of decide on any payments or stuff like that than any new employee. And that's why they're targeted. In fact, there's an actual term for this called whaling, right? So whale as in the larger. By the way, I mean, phishing, as you know, the word phishing comes from actual phishing, as in phishing. So phishing for information. So whales, I mean, they are the largest. Well, technically, whales are not fish, right? But they are the largest animals in the ocean. And these executives, right, they're called whales. And a specific phishing campaign targeting senior executives, that is called as whaling. Even in casinos, right, like in Las Vegas in the US, the customers who are betting more than $1 million, they are called whales, right? So basically a more attractive, a larger target. So again, the lesson to be learned here is that executives should definitely be covered in phishing simulations, right? I have had, so in a previous life, I used to run phishing simulations in an organization where the chairperson would click every time, right? And then they would get that message that you clicked, and the chairman wasn't happy. So he basically asked the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer, who was my boss, that, hey, I shouldn't receive these emails. So the CTO asked me to please remove the chairman from the list of employees who would be receiving the phishing simulations. Now, I mean, as a junior employee, and obviously I want to keep my job, that's why I had to listen. But again, this is not ideal behavior. The chairperson should know, right, that they will receive a lot of these phishing emails, right? And not all of them would be the mock phishing emails that I would send, but something that criminals would send. So they shouldn't make this kind of request, that they shouldn't be included in this exercise. The next example is this business email compromise, where the accounts payable received an email from the CEO saying that make this wire transfer. And they did it just because it seemed to be coming from the CEO. But the lesson to be learned here is that any external payments should always be verified, right? So let's say the person in accounts payable, accounts department receives an email from the CEO about this like strange payment. They should ask for verification, and it should be in a different channel. So let's say like the criminal, the cyber criminal has actually hacked into the CEO's account. Now, if they send a request and the recipient asks for confirmation, they can send an email right back from the same account saying, yes, I made the request, this is legitimate. So what is required is the verification should be by some other channel, so such as like a phone, or maybe like a Teams chat, or maybe like, I mean, basically anything other than email. So that reduces the risk. I mean, it is always possible that the attacker has hacked everything, right? They have hacked the email, they have hacked Teams, they have hacked the messenger, whatever. So better to just call up that person, right? It is. I mean, even though with artificial intelligence you can kind of replicate people's voices, obviously it is much more difficult. So the secondary verification reduces the chances of this kind of particular attack being successful. The third example is for me. So I once received an email which looked to be from Craigslist. That's what the symbol on the left is. They use that symbol. That says that, okay, your account has been hacked. Click here to change your password. So I received that email on my phone, and I clicked and I changed my password. But then, I mean, I'm a security professional, so it kind of clicked, hey, I mean, let me look a little deeper. And then obviously I saw that it was not a legitimate email. So the lesson to be learned here is that even people who are experienced, who are typically more knowledgeable than the average people, they can still get hacked, right? Even security professionals get hacked. And the another lesson is that this, because I was seeing this on a phone, which is like a smaller screen, some of the red flags that I would automatically detect on a laptop on a larger screen, they are not as visible on a smaller phone screen. So again, these are like lessons learned from my experience. So in conclusion, I would like to end this presentation with a few core messages. One being, if click rates in phishing simulations are not going down, ideally, once you kind of do this phishing simulations, keep clicking on the link, that should kind of trend downwards because people are learning from the exercise, right? If that is not happening, then obviously this is something that you should let senior management know. The second lesson is, if executives are repeatedly falling victim, don't excuse them from training, right? And hope the problem goes away. I mean, unless the executive themselves specifically request, right? I mean, there's only so much you can push. But yes, try to push back a little by saying that, kind of stressing the fact that executives will obviously be targeted just because of the higher access, higher privileges that they have as compared to the average employee. And finally, if even with all the tools, all the experience, all the knowledge, right? Somebody within industry, somebody who's working in a security team, they can still suffer from confirmation bias. In other words, it's kind of difficult to be really impartial when gauging the effectiveness of your own work. So in that case, it makes sense to bring in an outside expert, and obviously to keep people like me, a cybersecurity consultant, employed. So basically someone who kind of comes in and asks the tough questions and plays the role of the devil's advocate. Finally, I would like to end with this messaging, and this is from Dilbert. A lot of you may actually read Dilbert. I think that, those cartoon strips are amazing in the current office environment. And Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, he once said, "You don't have to be a person of influence to be influential. In fact, the most influential people in my life are probably not even aware of the things they've taught me." So I hope that you found this session to be somewhat influential. Thank you.